The fall that changed everything. The rain had not stopped all evening. Manhattan streets shimmered like rivers of glass beneath the glow of streetlights, and people hurried along with umbrellas tilted against the wind. In the middle of this restless city walked Elena Carter, her shoes worn thin, her coat too light for the biting cold, but her head held high despite the exhaustion dragging at her body. For years, Elena had lived on determination alone. Every morning before the sun rose, she worked at a local bakery, the sweet smell of bread clinging to her hair even as her arms ached from kneading dough. By noon, she was rushing across town to a small community daycare, where children's laughter filled her hours with both joy and fatigue. At night, when most of the city settled into warm apartments or lavish restaurants, Elena began her third shift, scrubbing floors, polishing glass walls, and cleaning conference rooms in the towering skyscraper known as Ashford Enterprises. It was the kind of building Elena had always admired from afar. 45 stories of steel and brilliance, its top floor catching the moonlight like a crown. The name Ashford was whispered with reverence in financial circles. Its CEO, Damien Ashford, was one of the youngest billionaires in America, a man whose name appeared in business magazines and whose face graced charity galas. People said he was untouchable, a man born into privilege, molded by wealth and sharpened by ambition. To Elena, he was not a man but a symbol of a world she would never belong to. Yet fate had arranged her life so that every night she walked into his empire not as a guest or partner but as a silent worker in a plain uniform, pushing a cleaning cart through the marble floors. That night, however, the building was alive in a way she had never seen before. The annual charity gala was in full motion, filling the ballroom with glittering gowns, sparkling jewels, and the clink of crystal glasses. Chandeliers scattered golden light across the crowd of Manhattan's most powerful. Elena had been asked to help serve drinks since several staff members had called in sick. She had hesitated. Serving wealthy strangers was not her comfort zone, but the extra pay was too important. Her daughter, Sophie, needed new winter boots, and Elena had promised herself her little girl would not suffer the cold as she had in childhood. So she tucked her fears away and tied the apron over her uniform. The ballroom was a world apart from the cracked sidewalks of Queens where Elena lived. She moved through the dazzling crowd, balancing trays of champagne, keeping her head down while snippets of conversation floated past her ears. The Hamptons this summer. Our jet is being serviced in Geneva. Did you see the new development project? These were lives she could never touch, but she could serve them silently. Every so often her thoughts drifted back to Sophie, asleep with the kind neighbor who babysat her, and Elena whispered promises in her heart. Just a little longer. Just a few more years of sacrifice, and I'll give you the life you deserve. But her body was not listening. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours, her only meal that day a cup of coffee and half a sandwich. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her chest until each breath felt shallow, each step heavier than the last. She forced herself to keep moving, ignoring the dizziness creeping in. She had worked through fatigue before. She could do it again, or so she thought. Across the room, Damien Ashford was enduring another dull conversation with an investor eager to boast about his portfolio. Damien nodded politely, his sharp gray eyes scanning the ballroom without real interest, until something unusual caught his attention. A server, a young woman with tired eyes and trembling hands, was moving unsteadily across the floor. She wasn't like the other staff who flowed with rehearsed precision. Her steps faltered, her tray rattled. Damien frowned. There was something fragile in the way she carried herself, as if sheer willpower was keeping her upright. Elena tried to steady herself by focusing on the chandeliers overhead, but the shimmering lights blurred into streaks. The murmurs of the crowd seemed far away, her heartbeat pounding louder than any music. Her knees wobbled. The tray tilted in her hands. For one desperate second she prayed she could hold on. Then the world slipped from her grasp. The crash of crystal on marble rang through the ballroom like thunder. Dozens of conversations broke off mid-sentence. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the glittering assembly. But Elena never saw their faces. She was falling, her body surrendering to exhaustion, her vision going black. Before she hit the floor, strong arms caught her. Damien had already moved. He didn't know why. Didn't stop to think. One moment he was across the room. The next, he was diving forward, his tuxedo jacket brushing against spilled champagne as he caught the unconscious woman against his chest. She was frighteningly light, her pulse racing beneath skin far too pale. For a heartbeat, the mighty ballroom stilled, silence spreading like a wave. The billionaire CEO, known for his composure and untouchable distance, was kneeling on the floor, holding a fainted server as if she were the only person in the world. "Call an ambulance," he ordered, his voice echoing with command. No one dared argue. Staff rushed, guests whispered, cameras clicked discreetly from phones, but Damien's focus remained on the young woman. He brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, his jaw tightening at the sight of exhaustion carved into her features. She wasn't a socialite, not a guest of honor, not anyone of power. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered. Elena stirred faintly, whispering a name. Sophie. Before sinking back into unconsciousness. Damien's chest tightened with something unexpected, something he couldn't name. He lifted her carefully, ignoring the whispers, the curious stares, the flash of jealousy in certain eyes. He was Damien Ashford, and he never carried anyone, but tonight he carried her. As paramedics arrived and the crowd buzzed with speculation, Damien's world had already shifted. He didn't know her story, didn't know her name beyond the whisper she had given, but something inside him knew with absolute certainty. This woman was about to change everything. The awakening. The sterile white light of the hospital seeped slowly into Elena's mind before her eyes opened. At first there was only sound, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the faint shuffle of rubber soles against linoleum floors, the soft murmur of nurses speaking in low tones just beyond her room. For a moment, confusion wrapped around her like fog. She tried to remember where she was supposed to be, the gala, the trays, the dazzling chandeliers, and then panic surged. She sat up too quickly, her body trembling, the IV line pulling against her wrist. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice raw with fear. "I need to get home to Sophie." A calm voice cut through the haze. "She's safe." Elena turned her head, and her breath caught when she saw him, sitting in the chair beside her bed, his black tuxedo jacket folded neatly over the armrest, his bow tie loosened, was Damien Ashford himself, the billionaire, the man who had caught her when the world collapsed beneath her. His gray eyes were steady, his posture elegant even in fatigue, but there was something in his expression she had never seen in photographs or magazines. Concern. Genuine, unguarded concern. "You've been asleep for hours," Damien said, leaning forward slightly. "The doctor said you collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. You need rest, not panic." But Elena's heart raced faster. "I can't. Stay here, I can't afford this. Please, I have to go home. My daughter is waiting." Damien lifted a hand gently, stopping her words without force, only steadiness. "Your daughter is fine. Sophie, isn't it? My team contacted your neighbor, Rosa. She's watching over her right now. Sophie is sleeping peacefully." Elena froze, stunned that he even knew her child's name. How do you know about Sophie?" "You whispered her name before you lost consciousness," Damien explained. His voice softened as he added, "It was the only thing you said, so I made sure she was safe." Tears welled in Elena's eyes and she pressed her hands to her face. Embarrassment, relief, gratitude and fear tangled inside her until she couldn't tell them apart. "I shouldn't even be here," she whispered through her trembling fingers. "This hospital must cost more than I make in a year. I don't belong in this room." Damien rose from the chair and moved to the bedside, his presence commanding but not overwhelming. He was tall, his shadow stretching across the sterile walls, yet his tone was gentle, almost coaxing. "Don't concern yourself with the bills, I've taken care of them." Elena's head snapped up, disbelief sparking in her tired eyes. "You can't." I can't accept that. I barely even know you. I don't want charity. Damien studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Most people he dealt with would have accepted his gesture instantly, eager to bask in the glow of his wealth. But here was a woman who looked as if life had beaten her down 100 times, and still she held on to her dignity like a shield. There was strength in her refusal, pride, and something about it unsettled him in a way nothing else did. This isn't charity, he said firmly. This is responsibility. You collapsed in my building at my event. That makes it my problem, and whether you like it or not, I don't walk away from problems I can solve. Elena stared at him, caught between defiance and weariness. Her throat ached, her body still weak, but her spirit resisted surrendering so easily. I've worked my whole life for everything I have. I don't want to be someone's project. For the first time in weeks, Damien felt something almost like a smile tug at his lips. Not the polished, rehearsed smile he wore at board meetings, but a flicker of amusement that broke through his usual armor. You are not a project, Miss Carter. But you are someone who deserves better than collapsing in front of hundreds of people because you're trying to survive on nothing but coffee and sheer willpower. The words hit her harder than she expected, maybe because no one had ever said them before. People saw her as dependable, hardworking, resilient, but no one had ever told her she deserved better. She felt a lump rise in her throat and she looked away, blinking back tears. For a while, silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of machines. Damien remained by her side, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving her. He had business to attend to, a company empire waiting for him, yet here he was, sitting in a hospital room with a single mother who had fainted on the ballroom floor. Elena couldn't understand it. Finally, Damien broke the silence. Tell me, Elena, why are you working yourself to death? 3 jobs, barely eating, no sleep. What are you chasing? Elena's lips trembled, but she forced herself to answer honestly. I'm chasing a life for my daughter. Sophie is only 5. Her father left before she could even remember his face. I promised myself she wouldn't grow up the way I did, struggling, watching the world pass her by. So I work. And if it means I collapse sometimes, then so be it. At least she'll have food. At least she'll have shoes that fit. At least she'll know I never gave up on her. Her voice cracked, but her gaze was unwavering, and Damien felt something shift deep inside him. He had listened to countless pitches from entrepreneurs, investors, and executives, but none of their speeches carried the raw conviction that burned in Elena's words. This was not ambition. This was survival. This was love in its purest form. He sat back slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. In all his years of building empires, acquiring companies, and navigating the cold corridors of power, Damien had never met someone like her. She had nothing, yet she carried herself with more dignity than people who owned entire penthouses. Elena, he said quietly, almost testing the sound of her name. You shouldn't have to choose between survival and living. You shouldn't have to sacrifice your health just to keep your child warm. That's not strength. That's desperation. And desperation breaks even the strongest sooner or later. She lowered her eyes, ashamed, because part of her knew he was right. But shame turned quickly to defensiveness. So what do you suggest, that I just stop working? That I sit around and wait for someone like you to rescue me? That's not how life works for people like me. Damien's eyes sharpened, not with anger but with resolve. No, I don't suggest you stop working. I suggest you start working differently, for me. Her head snapped up, startled. What? My assistant is leaving for an overseas branch next month, Damien explained calmly. I need someone reliable, someone with resilience, discipline, and the ability to manage chaos. From what I've seen and from what you've told me, you have more experience in those skills than most of the people I've interviewed. I want to offer you the position. Elena's mouth fell open, shock stealing her voice. I don't have a degree. I don't have business experience. I clean floors, Mr. Ashford. That's all I know. That's not all you know, Damien countered, his voice low but unwavering. You know how to juggle 3 jobs while raising a child alone. You know how to stretch every dollar, negotiate every expense, and manage time with precision. You know responsibility, sacrifice, and loyalty. Those aren't weaknesses, they're strengths, and they're exactly what I need. Elena shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't. I don't belong in your world. Everyone will see me as a mistake. For the first time, Damien's composure cracked just enough for sincerity to bleed through. Elena, listen to me. I've built a world of glass towers and gold boardrooms, but it's empty. You, on the other hand, have built a world for your daughter out of nothing but grit and love. You belong more than half the people I've ever hired. And as for what others think, he paused, his eyes locking on hers. I don't care. I care about what I see. And I see someone worth betting on. The room seemed to still around them. Elena felt the weight of his words pressing against her fear, pushing at the walls she had built. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to imagine a life where she wasn't collapsing from exhaustion, where Sophie didn't see her mother worn thin every day. But trust had never come easily, not after all the disappointments, not after the abandonment that had taught her to rely on no one but herself. I need time to think, she whispered, her voice trembling. Damien nodded once as if he had expected that. Take all the time you need, but know this, Elena. You deserve more than surviving, and so does Sophie. He stepped back, slipping on his jacket, restoring his polished image in an instant. But before he left the room, he turned once more, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. And for what it's worth, thank you for reminding me what strength really looks like. When the door closed behind him, Elena sank back against the pillow, her heart racing. Gratitude warred, with fear, hope tangled with doubt. She thought of Sophie's smile, of the little boots she still needed to buy, of the weight of years spent fighting alone. Could she trust him? Could she step into a world that didn't belong to her? In the quiet of that hospital room, Carter realized that her life had split into 2 paths, one of fear, one of possibility. And the choice she made next would change everything, into a different world. The morning light stretched across the skyline of Manhattan as Elena stood before the glass doors of Ashford Enterprises. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished surface, and she barely recognized herself. For the first time in years, she was not wearing a faded uniform or an apron with grease stains. Instead, she wore a modest navy blue dress Damien had insisted she buy with the advance from her new salary. Her hair neatly tied back, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her bag. Around her, employees streamed inside, men and women, in crisp suits walking with purpose as if they had been born into this rhythm. Elena, however, felt like an imposter at the gates of a kingdom she had no right to enter. Her daughter Sophie had woken that morning with unusual excitement. Mama, are you going to work in the big castle now? She had asked, eyes shining as she held her cereal spoon. Elena had laughed nervously and kissed her forehead, promising they would celebrate her first day after school with ice cream. The truth was, Elena was terrified. Every instinct told her she didn't belong here, that at any moment someone would point her out as a fraud and escort her out of the building. But the memory of Sophie's proud little smile and Damien's steady voice telling her she was more capable than she realized gave her just enough strength to step through those doors. The lobby was vast, a cathedral of marble and glass alive with the hum of business. Elena followed the directions given by the receptionist and rode the elevator to the 40th floor, where Damien's executive office occupied the corner with sweeping views of the city. When the doors opened, Elena's breath caught. This was no ordinary workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the area with sunlight, illuminating sleek furniture and artwork that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Every detail radiated wealth and power. Damien's assistant, or rather his soon-to-be former assistant, met her at the entrance. Clara Johnson was tall, polished, and graceful, with the kind of poise that came from years in elite schools. She greeted Elena with a polite smile, but there was an unmistakable edge of curiosity in her eyes, as if she were studying an unusual specimen. "You must be Miss Carter," Clara said, extending a manicured hand. Mr. Ashford asked me to show you the ropes before I leave for London. Elena shook her hand nervously. Yes, thank you, I appreciate it. Clara led her through the office, explaining the schedules, the contacts, the endless lists of responsibilities. You'll be managing Mr. Ashford's calendar, coordinating, with department heads, preparing documents for board meetings, screening calls. In short, keeping his world from collapsing under the weight of itself. Clara explained smoothly. It's demanding, but if you're organized, you'll manage. Her eyes flicked to Elena's modest dress before quickly returning to the files in her hand. You will have to get used to people underestimating you. This position isn't just about efficiency, it's about standing your ground. Those words lingered as Elena was finally shown into Damien's office. He was standing by the window, his silhouette outlined against the bright city beyond. He turned when she entered, and for a moment, the tension in her chest eased. He wasn't just a CEO here. He was the same man who had sat in a hospital chair all night, the man who had spoken to her with honesty instead of condescension. Good morning, Elena, Damien said warmly. Welcome to your new world. Her new world indeed. The next weeks passed in a blur of steep learning curves. Elena threw herself into the role with the same determination she had used to survive years of hardship. She learned Damien's schedule, memorized his preferences, and gradually became confident enough to manage the flow of people who came through his doors. At first, many executives regarded her with skepticism. She overheard whispers in the hallways. She's not qualified. She used to clean floors here. Ashford is losing his edge hiring like this. The weight of their judgment pressed heavily, but Elena refused to let it break her. She worked longer hours, studied every file Clara left behind, and quietly began to prove them wrong. One late evening, Damien returned to his office after a meeting to find Elena still at her desk, her brow furrowed as she typed notes from 3 different departments. Papers were spread around her like a battlefield she was determined to conquer. He paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. You should be home with Sophie, he said gently. Elena looked up, startled, then sighed. I will be, but I need to finish this. If I can prepare your morning briefing in advance, it'll save you time. Damien stepped closer, a flicker of admiration crossing his usually composed features. Most people take months to adjust to this job. You've managed in weeks. Don't burn yourself out, Elena. I didn't bring you here to watch you collapse. Again. His words were a reminder of how far she had come, but also of the fragility of her journey. She smiled faintly. Don't worry. I'm stronger than I look. It wasn't just the workload that challenged her. There were obstacles with sharper edges. Vanessa Grant, the director of corporate strategy and a longtime ally of Damien, made no attempt to hide her disdain. With her impeccable pedigree and Ivy League background, Vanessa saw Elena's presence as an insult. During meetings, she interrupted Elena, questioned her input, and often spoke with a tone laced with quiet mockery. With all due respect, Mr. Ashford, Vanessa said one morning during a board meeting, I do wonder whether someone with unconventional experience is suited to advise on matters of this scale. The room fell silent, eyes flicking between Vanessa and Elena. Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks, but before she could speak, Damien's voice cut through the tension like steel. Unconventional experience often sees solutions the rest of us overlook. Elena's insight into employee morale saved us nearly $2 million last quarter. Unless you can show me better results, Vanessa, I'd advise you to focus on your department. The sting of his words silenced the room, but the exchange left Elena shaken. Later, she confronted Damien in private. You can't keep defending me like that, she insisted, her voice tight. People already think I'm here because you feel sorry for me. Every time you step in, it makes it worse. Damien leaned against his desk, his gray eyes locked on hers. I didn't defend you because I pity you. I defended you because you were right. There's a difference. Elena exhaled, torn between gratitude and frustration. I don't want to be your mistake, Damien. I don't want Sophie to see me as someone who only got here because someone powerful took pity on her. His expression softened, but his tone remained resolute. "Elena, listen to me. You are not here because of pity. You are here because you earned it. Because you showed me strength I haven't seen in years. Stop trying to measure yourself by their standards. You belong because you've proven you do." The words touched something deep inside her, something that had been buried under years of survival. Slowly, she began to believe them. She began to walk into meetings with her, head a little higher, her voice steadier. She began to realize that her worth was not defined by the marble floors she once scrubbed, but by the resilience she carried within her. Yet, not everyone was ready to accept her. Vanessa's resentment deepened. Others whispered louder. Some even began watching her closely, waiting for a mistake that would confirm their prejudice. And behind all of it, Damien's presence loomed, supportive, steady, but increasingly complicated. For Damien, what had started as an instinctive act of compassion was becoming something far more dangerous. He found himself lingering in conversations with Elena, noticing the way her laughter lit up the room, feeling a pull he had not allowed himself in years. He had built walls of steel around his life, walls no one had crossed. But Elena, with her unpolished honesty and her quiet fire, was breaching those walls without even trying. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Damien offered to drive Elena and Sophie home. Sophie climbed into the back seat, chatting animatedly about her school project, while Elena sat quietly, her nerves stretched taut in the luxury of his sleek black car. When they reached her apartment building, Sophie held up a drawing she had made at school. It was 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a tall glass tower. "Look, Mama," she said proudly. "It's you, me, and Mr. Ashford at your new work castle." Damien took the drawing gently, studying it as though it were a masterpiece. "May I keep this for my office?" he asked. Sophie beamed and nodded. Elena, however, felt her heart twist. Sophie was growing attached, and Elena could not shake the fear that one day, when this ended, her daughter's heart would break. That night, as she lay awake, Elena realized the truth she had been avoiding. She was no longer just surviving. She was building a life that was dangerously close to hope, and hope, she knew, could be as fragile as glass. Bonds and betrayal. The months after Elena began working at Ashford Enterprises were both the most challenging and the most transformative of her life. She found herself caught between 2 worlds: the modest life she shared with Sophie in their small Queens apartment, and the glittering skyscraper world of Damien Ashford, where billion-dollar deals and powerful decisions shaped the future of industries. Each morning when she walked through the glass doors of the building, Elena carried her old insecurities like shadows clinging to her shoes. But each evening when she returned home, she carried something new: the growing confidence of someone who was no longer just surviving, but beginning to thrive. Her days stretched into late hours filled with meetings, correspondence, and the endless demands of managing Damien's empire. Yet what surprised her most was not the weight of the work, but the way Damien himself treated her. Unlike the image the world painted of him, cold, ruthless, untouchable, she saw a man who listened, who valued her input, who asked her opinion not out of politeness but because he genuinely wanted it. He was demanding, yes, but he never belittled her for mistakes. Instead, he guided her, challenged her, and in quiet moments, revealed a vulnerability he kept hidden from everyone else. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Elena began to see him differently. They had stayed late in his office reviewing reports. Sophie sat cross-legged on the carpet nearby, coloring happily with a box of crayons Damien had stocked just for her visits. When Sophie grew sleepy, Damien had taken off his suit jacket, knelt beside her, and gently carried her to the couch where she could nap. Elena had watched, her heart tightening at the sight of a man the world saw as a titan of industry holding her daughter with a tenderness that didn't belong in boardrooms. For Sophie, Damien was simply Mr. Ashford, the man who kept her juice boxes in the office refrigerator and listened seriously when she explained her drawings. For Elena, The line between gratitude and something deeper began to blur. But not everyone viewed this bond with warmth. Vanessa Grant, still nursing her resentment, grew increasingly bold in her opposition. She had dedicated years to earning Damien's trust and believed she was destined to stand at his side. Watching Elena, a woman with no pedigree, no degree, and a past spent scrubbing floors, capture his attention filled her with fury. Vanessa began to weave a quiet campaign of sabotage, subtle comments in board meetings designed to undermine. Elena whispered insinuations to shareholders about impropriety. She even arranged for a leak of photographs showing Damien leaving Elena's apartment late at night. Innocent evenings spent working on presentations with Sophie asleep nearby. But in the eyes of the public, they could be spun into scandal. Elena began to feel the pressure. Gossip spread like wildfire in the corridors of the company. She noticed the way certain employees looked at her, their eyes filled with judgment as if waiting for her to slip. At night, she lay awake wondering if she had made a mistake accepting Damien's offer. She had come here to build a better life for Sophie, but what if her presence destroyed Damien's reputation instead? What if she was the weakness his enemies would exploit? One evening, unable to bear the weight any longer, Elena confronted him. "You can't keep shielding me," she said, her voice trembling as she stood in his office, the city lights stretching out behind the glass wall. "Every time you defend me in front of them, it proves their point. They already think I don't belong here, and you make it worse by protecting me." Damien studied her silently, his jaw set, his hands resting on the desk. Finally, he rose and crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of her. "Elena," he said quietly but firmly, "you think I'm protecting you out of pity. You're wrong. I protect you because you're worth protecting. You've brought more clarity, more balance to this place than people with decades of experience. You've given Sophie stability while carrying burdens most people would have collapsed under years ago. And if they can't see that, it's not your failure, it's theirs." Tears stung her eyes, but she shook her head. "You don't understand. I can't afford for Sophie to see me as a mistake. I can't let her believe our place here depends on your mercy. She needs to know her mother stood on her own feet." Damien's gaze softened, and in that moment, the polished armor of the billionaire seemed to slip away. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers lightly, as if asking permission to bridge the gap between them. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it, "you've stood on your own feet for far too long. Let someone stand beside you for once." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Elena's heart pounded. She wanted to step back, to remind herself of all the reasons this was dangerous. The gossip, the differences between them, the risk of hope. But instead she found herself standing still, her hand trembling beneath his touch, her defenses crumbling one by one. From that night, something shifted between them. The boundaries that had defined their relationship, CEO and assistant, billionaire and single mother, began to blur. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, not just about business, but about life, about loss, about the quiet, emptiness both had carried in different ways. Damien spoke of his parents who had valued appearances over affection, leaving him with wealth but not warmth. Elena spoke of Sophie's father, who had left when responsibility became too heavy. They were different, yet their loneliness mirrored one another. Still, the world outside their moments of closeness was growing darker. Vanessa's plotting reached a peak when she presented a file of evidence to a group of board members. Photographs, call logs, expense reports twisted to look like misuse of company resources. "I bring this forward not because I doubt Mr. Ashford's leadership," she said with feigned regret, "but because I fear for the company's reputation. We cannot allow sentiment to cloud judgment at this level." The board was divided. Some had grown to respect Elena's work and saw Vanessa's bitterness for what it was. Others, however, seized on the opportunity to question Damien's decisions. Rumors leaked into the press. Headlines began to circulate. Ashford CEO's questionable relationship with employee raises eyebrows. When Elena saw the stories, her world crumbled. She imagined Sophie's classmates' parents whispering about her. She imagined Damien's empire shaken because of her presence. That night she stood in his office, her hands clenched, her voice breaking. "This is exactly what I feared, Damien. I can't do this. I can't be the reason your name is dragged through the mud." Damien stepped closer, his eyes blazing with something fierce. "You think I care about headlines? Let them talk. I've spent my life building this empire, and it means nothing if I can't choose who stands beside me. But it's not just about you," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "It's about Sophie. I can't let her grow up in the shadow of scandal. She deserves stability, not chaos." For the first time, Damien's composure wavered completely. He reached for her hands, holding them tightly as if he were afraid she might disappear. "Then let me give her that stability. Let me give both of you what you've never had. Security. Not just financial, but emotional. You don't have to fight alone anymore." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside her. For years, Elena had carried the weight of survival alone, refusing to lean on anyone for fear they would leave. Yet here was a man who could have anyone, who could walk away at the first sign of trouble, standing in front of her with unwavering resolve. Slowly, painfully, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't a burden to him. Maybe she was exactly what he had been searching for, too. Their bond deepened in the days that followed, though the storm outside continued to rage. Vanessa's schemes were far from over, and the pressure from the media only grew. Elena found herself walking a tightrope between hope and fear, torn between the desire to protect Damien from further scrutiny and the undeniable truth that her heart was no longer her own. Late one evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep on Damien's office couch, Elena and Damien stood together by the window looking out over the glowing city. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice quiet. "Elena, I've lived my life surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and I've never felt as alive as I do standing here with you. Tell me I'm not alone in this." Elena's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "You're not alone," she whispered. "That's what scares me." Damien's lips curved into the faintest smile, and for the first time, Elena let herself imagine a future she had never dared to dream. But what neither of them knew was that Vanessa's final play was already in motion. A move that would threaten not just Elena's place at Ashford Enterprises, but everything she had built for Sophie. The choice of tomorrow, the storm that had been brewing around Ashford Enterprises, finally broke. For weeks, whispers had rippled through the boardrooms and spilled into the press. Elena's name was printed in headlines alongside Damien's, framed in the cruel language of scandal. Phrases like improper relationship and abuse of power echoed through media outlets. Photographs, carefully selected and taken out of context, painted a story of favoritism and impropriety. Each morning when Elena dropped Sophie off at school, she felt the eyes of other parents on her, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing against her back. Damien fought back with the force of a man who refused to be controlled by lies. At board meetings, he defended Elena's contributions with unflinching resolve, citing her cost-saving initiatives and her innovative approach to community programs. "Judge her by results," he told them, his voice sharp with authority, "not by the prejudices you carry." Some listened, but others remained unconvinced. Vanessa Grant had been thorough in her campaign, and her poison had spread deeply. For Elena, the weight became unbearable. Late at night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Sophie's gentle breathing beside her. She thought about how hard she had fought to give her daughter stability, how much she had sacrificed to keep her world intact. And now, because of her, Sophie's future was being dragged into a spotlight filled with cruelty. The thought gnawed at her until she could no longer keep silent. One evening, she stood in Damien's office, her hands clenched tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Damien, I can't let Sophie grow up in the shadow of this scandal. I won't let her carry the weight of whispers and judgment because of me. Damien turned from the window where he had been staring out at the city. His face, usually carved from stone, softened with something close to fear. So what are you saying? Elena forced herself to meet his eyes even as her heart broke. I'm saying I need to resign. I'm saying I need to walk away before this destroys you, before it destroys her. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Damien crossed the floor slowly until he stood just inches from her. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. Elena, if you walk away, you're not protecting me. You're protecting Vanessa. You're protecting everyone who wants to believe you're unworthy. Is that the lesson you want Sophie to learn? That when the world throws lies at you, you bow your head and retreat? The words cut deeply. Elena's lips trembled, but her resolve wavered. You don't understand. I've spent my whole life fighting battles no one else could see. I can't drag Sophie into another one. Damien reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. You're not dragging her into a battle. You're showing her what courage looks like, and I won't let you do this alone. I didn't fight my way to the top of this empire just to surrender to gossip. Elena, you are not a liability. You are the reason I've remembered why any of this matters at all. Her tears spilled freely then, but before she could reply, the office door burst open. Clara, Damien's former assistant, who had returned briefly from London, stood breathless, with a folder clutched in her hands. Mr. Ashford, she said urgently, you need to see this. Inside the folder were emails, recorded conversations, and contracts, proof of Vanessa's betrayal. She had not only orchestrated the smear campaign but had also been leaking sensitive company information to competitors in exchange for promises of future power. Clara had discovered the trail while reviewing files, horrified to realize the extent of Vanessa's treachery. Damien's jaw tightened as he flipped through the evidence, his anger restrained but lethal. She thought she could dismantle my company with lies, he said coldly, but she's destroyed herself. The next morning, Damien called an emergency board meeting. Elena sat silently at the back of the room, her heart pounding, while Vanessa sat confidently at the table, certain of her victory. But when Damien laid the folder on the table and began to present the evidence, Vanessa's composure faltered. One by one, board members read the emails, listened to the recordings, and watched the carefully constructed image of their director of strategy unravel into corruption. When it was over, Damien stood tall, his voice ringing with finality. This company was built on integrity, and I will not allow deceit to corrode it from within. Vanessa Grant is hereby terminated, effective immediately, and her actions will be referred to legal authorities. The boardroom buzzed with shock, some with satisfaction, others with shame at having doubted him. But all eyes turned next to Elena. For a moment, she wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the shadows. Then Damien looked at her, steady, unwavering, and she felt strength return. She rose slowly, her voice soft but clear. I never asked for any of this, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. But I worked hard because I wanted to prove to myself and to my daughter that dignity doesn't come from where you start, but from how you rise. If my presence here has taught you anything, I hope it's that worth cannot be measured by resumes or pedigrees, but by resilience, loyalty, and heart. The room fell silent. And in that silence, Elena felt the shift. Not everyone would accept her. Some would always judge. But for the first time, she no longer cared. She had spoken her truth, and Sophie would see her mother standing tall. In the weeks that followed, the storm gradually faded. Vanessa's downfall became the real story, and Damien's decisive leadership restored confidence in the company. The gossip about Elena dwindled, replaced by grudging respect as her initiatives continued to bear fruit. Within the company, employees who had once whispered now sought her advice, recognizing her quiet strength. At home, life blossomed in ways Elena had never dared imagine. Sophie thrived, her laughter filling the apartment with warmth. Damien became a constant presence, not as a CEO or benefactor, but as a man who read bedtime stories, helped with school projects, and discovered joy in the simple domestic moments he had never known before. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Damien and Elena sat on her small balcony with Sophie asleep inside. The golden light painted their faces, and the silence between them was no longer heavy with fear, but comfortable with hope. Damien turned to her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Elena, I've spent years surrounded by power and wealth, but none of it ever gave me peace. You and Sophie, you've given me something I didn't know I was missing. You've given me home." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not born of exhaustion or fear. They were born of gratitude, of love, of a future she had once thought impossible. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "And you've given me something I thought I'd lost long ago," she whispered. Hope, as the city lights flickered to life below them. Elena realized that the collapse that had once humiliated her in front of the world had not been the end of her strength. It had been the beginning of everything.